Welcome to the debate. So, when you decide to buy or sell a home, you obviously hire a licensed real estate professional. They're meant to be your guide and, really crucially, your advocate. But, what happens when that same guide decides to, well, lead both the buyer and the seller through the exact same transaction?
Yeah, that's precisely where it gets tricky. Today, we're going to dive deep into this diverse landscape of real estate representation. Specifically, we're focusing on the, let's say, critical and often pretty controversial practice of dual agency.
Right. And the central question we're grappling with here, and this comes straight from our source material, is essentially this. Does the practice of dual agency, where one agent represents both sides in a deal, does it offer such beneficial efficiencies that it creates a genuinely streamlined, mutually agreeable outcome? Or does it fundamentally compromise the agent's absolute dedicated fiduciary duty to both clients?
And I definitely land on the latter side. My position is that dual agency creates, well, an unavoidable deep-seated conflict of interest. I mean, think about it. The buyer wants the lowest price, the seller wants the highest. When those goals are just diametrically opposed, dedicated, separate representation is really the only reliable way to fully protect the financial and, frankly, the legal interests of both parties involved.
Okay, I see the inherent risk. I do. But I'd argue that dual agency is often beneficial precisely because of that streamlined communication and the operational efficiency it offers. Look, when it's executed by an experienced professional, someone who really understands the full context of a deal, the agent acts more like a skilled intermediary. They're focused on facilitating a successful close rather than, just fostering adversarial negotiation. So let's really consider the core function here, facilitating the sale and purchase of a home. An agent who's experienced on both the buy side and the sell side, well, they're uniquely positioned to achieve this goal for both parties, often simultaneously. As Agent Miranda Biedenharn notes in the material, agents running both sides can navigate that bridge and know what a seller is looking for and the buyer's requirements. That provides vital perspective to both clients. And dual agency offers, two tangible, pretty practical benefits. First, improved communication, because there's really only one primary contact managing the information flow. And second, the concrete financial benefit of potentially reduced commission costs, which, let's face it, saves sellers money in the final accounting. Plus, the material even suggests a unique information advantage. A buyer's agent in a dual capacity might gain earlier or maybe deeper access to details about a property than an agent who is working strictly, outside the listing brokerage. This kind of information asymmetry can significantly smooth the path to closing the deal.
Well, I come at it from a completely different angle, really prioritizing loyalty over that perceived efficiency you mentioned. The fundamental legal conflict of interest here is just, it's too significant to simply brush aside. I mean, that's precisely why we see it prohibited outright in 8 different states already. A seller's agent is legally bound to maximize the sale price for their client. A buyer's agent is legally bound to negotiate the best possible terms and the lowest price for their client. These two objectives aren't just misaligned, they are directly financially opposed. It's simple math. So dedicated representation ensures the agent is truly, as the material says, laser-focused solely on their client-specific goals, which eliminates those internal conflicts of interest. For instance, when a buyer engages an independent advocate, often someone holding the accredited buyer's representative designation, the ABR, which signifies, specialized training in buyer advocacy, that client gets an independent ally, someone who performs unbiased due diligence and can aggressively negotiate terms to win in competitive markets. You simply cannot split loyalty 50-50 when potentially thousands, even tens of thousands of dollars are on the line.
And let's delve into that really crucial distinction you brought up earlier, the nature of fiduciary duty. A dual agent is supposedly tasked with balancing interests, right? But this balancing act, by its very nature, diminishes the full, robust advocacy that clients are hiring and, frankly, paying good money for.
The source material makes an interesting distinction here, noting that in some jurisdictions, agents can act as transaction brokers. They represent both parties, but, and this is key, not in a fiduciary capacity. Now, I find this distinction deeply troubling from a client service standpoint.
A client hires an agent for advocacy, for someone to fight hard for their best financial outcome, not just for, process management or pushing paperwork. If the agent effectively sheds that fiduciary hat, that core duty of utmost loyalty, confidentiality, and full disclosure, then where does the client's trust, their ultimate protection, actually lie?
Okay, I absolutely see why you think that. And it's true, pure, singular fiduciary advocacy is highly valued. But let me offer perhaps a different perspective on this shift towards facilitation, as you put it. In today's complex markets, speed and certainty often hold tremendous value for both buyers and sellers. So in non-fiduciary facilitation, the agent acts more like an intermediary. Their focus is on moving the deal forward towards a successful conclusion by anticipating and mitigating obstacles from both sides. This kind of expertise allows the agent to, as the material puts it, navigate that bridge by understanding both the seller's realistic bottom line and the buyer's genuine capacity or top line. This professional balance, focused on finding a viable middle ground, helps ensure everyone can get the win-win of what they want, which ultimately is the keys to the house changing hands. A purely partisan agent, focused solely on maximizing one single metric, might actually risk missing the window for a successful deal altogether.
And this is a big but, this transactional approach seems to fundamentally compromise confidentiality, which is an absolute cornerstone of fiduciary duty. Let's make this really concrete. If a dual agent learns, say that the buyer is actually pre-approved for and willing to spend $550,000, even though their initial offer was only $500,000. The fiduciary duty to the seller would seem to demand that the agent share that confidential information to maximize the sale price, right? Conversely, fiduciary duty to the buyer demands that very same information remains strictly guarded. So how does an agent ethically resolve that conflict without breaching their duty to one party or the other? They're legally prohibited from disclosing that information to the seller, which means effectively they are actively failing to fully advocate for the seller's best financial interests.
Right, and that is the crucial tension point, absolutely. And it really highlights why transparency and mandated disclosure are the absolutely essential legal foundations underpinning dual agency. I'm just not convinced by the premise that this represents an unavoidable failure of ethics. Rather, I see it as a structural adjustment in the agency relationship itself, one that critically requires explicit client consent. When clients agree to dual agency, they are, in effect, explicitly waiving the right to that specific type of confidential information sharing you described. They are consenting to the agent acting as a more neutral party, a function quite distinct from pure advocacy, where the agent's duty shifts towards process integrity, honesty, and fair dealing, rather than maximizing one party's gains potentially at the expense of the other. It's a trade-off, yes, but one they knowingly accept, often for transactional speed and those potential cost savings.
The perceived conflict is often, I think, mitigated by these tangible, immediate transactional benefits. Dual agency definitely simplifies the chain of command. It just makes the whole system move faster, smoother, and critically, we have to acknowledge the financial incentive. Reduced commissions directly save money, especially for sellers. Historically, sellers cover the full commission and, as the material notes, they often still feel the need to cover the buyer's agent commission to attract buyers. So when a single agent accepts a lower overall fee to manage both sides, that cost pressure is addressed head-on, providing immediate, measurable savings for the client.
Okay, that's an interesting point regarding efficiency and cost savings, but I really challenge the idea that perhaps marginal commission reduction outweighs the sheer value of specialized negotiation. You're highlighting cost, but I want to emphasize value, the net financial outcome for the client. Separate agents provide what the material calls enhanced negotiation. The buyer's advocate works specifically for favorable purchase terms, and that's not just price. It's contingencies like inspections, financing, closing dates, while the seller's agent fights ruthlessly to maximize that final sale price. And we have strong empirical evidence, data that demonstrates the immense financial value of this dedicated expertise. The National Association of Realtors data from 2023, for example, shows that agent-assisted sales sold for a median price of $435,000. That's compared to only $380,000 for homes sold directly by the owner.
That $55,000 gap, yes, it's a powerful statistic, and it clearly shows the non-negotiable value of hiring an agent versus going it alone. I completely agree there. But I would frame that data slightly differently. That comparison is between an agent-involved sale and a forced sale by owner, or FSBO transaction, which completely lacks professional guidance on either side. It doesn't actually prove that dual agency inherently leads to a worse financial outcome than separate agency. It's entirely possible, maybe even probable, that an experienced dual agent achieves a price much closer to that $435,000 figure while still offering the cost benefit of reduced commissions. We're debating the efficacy of internal representation versus external, not professionalism versus, well, amateurism. An experienced agent, even operating in a dual capacity, is still leveraging professional expertise to set the best realistic price and terms for the market.
But when you have two separate professionals involved, their interests are inherently, structurally aligned only with their respective client. This ensures they leave no stone unturned in their specific roles. Even a slight, perhaps unconscious reduction in advocacy, like, say, failing to press for the absolute highest possible price because the agent knows the buyer's limitations from confidential discussions, that could easily erase any marginal savings from a reduced commission. The potential loss in sale price due to that diminished adversarial negotiation, well, it's often far greater than the commission reduction itself. We really have to look at the total financial picture, the bottom line for the client, not just the commission structure in isolation. And my final concern really centers entirely on independence and the potential for a pretty severe power imbalance, particularly, I think, affecting buyers.
The risk seems too high that a buyer might rely on the seller's agent, who, let's remember, is structurally paid from the seller's proceeds, and that agent, as the material cautions, might make you feel like they are helping you as a buyer, even if you are not paying them. That quote speaks directly to the inherent bias, or at least the potential for bias, in the system. An independent buyer's agent, someone solely contracted by and focused on the buyer's needs, remains absolutely essential, in my view, to protect the buyer's interests against the listing agent, who, at the end of the day, fundamentally remains the seller's primary advocate. If you're buying a home, arguably the biggest purchase of your life, you really need your own champion in your corner.
I'm just not entirely sold on the premise that independence is the only guarantor of protection, especially provided the structure is fully transparent, as required by law. Dual agency, as we've said, requires full disclosure and explicit written consent from both parties precisely to manage that potential risk. When clients agree, they recognize that the agent's function has shifted, moving from pure advocacy towards intermediation. And given the landscape of specializations we see in the industry, you mentioned the ABR for buyers, right? We also have the Seller Representative Specialist, SRS, for sellers, and the Certified Residential Specialist, CRS, which is widely regarded as the highest residential credential. Clients should, I believe, be able to rely on a professional agent's integrity and their specialized training. The expertise required to earn these credentials includes understanding the ethical framework necessary to manage a consensual dual arrangement without breaching the core trust needed to get the transaction successfully closed.
Well, while I certainly respect the rigor of professional credentialing, I still believe that relying primarily on professional integrity to override what is an inherent, legally recognized financial conflict of interest, it just places too high a burden on the client, potentially. The client is often navigating the biggest financial transaction of their lives, perhaps stressed, maybe unfamiliar with the nuances. They need someone whose goals perfectly mirror their own, not someone who is actively trying to find a happy medium between two fundamentally competing interests. So when the choice is framed as process simplicity versus dedicated financial protection, I argue the latter must always win out, especially for buyers who are often less experienced in these complex transactions.
And I'd summarize my position by asserting that the source material itself provides a strong argument for the practical, functional benefits of dual agency. It suggests that an experienced agent, one who truly understands the full scope of the deal from both perspectives, can successfully facilitate a transaction that satisfies both parties. It can streamline the process, offer potential cost reductions, and ultimately achieve a desirable outcome for everyone involved. It relies heavily on a professional's expertise to ethically bridge that gap between opposing interests, but only when clients explicitly consent to that structure.
And ultimately, from my perspective, while certain operational efficiencies and yes, potential cost savings might exist in dual agency scenarios, the fundamental ethical requirement for an agent is to uphold a dedicated fiduciary duty. When an agent attempts to serve two masters with opposing financial goals, clients, especially those requiring complex negotiation or facing challenging market conditions, are simply best served by having their own independent, laser-focused advocate. The inherent risk of diminished advocacy, however slight, is just too high a cost to pay for mere convenience.
It's clear the roles of real estate professionals are complex, and clients really must carefully weigh the value they place on specialized, dedicated advocacy against the perhaps simpler transactional process offered by a dual agency structure. It's definitely a fundamental trade-off, one that continues to shape the market and deserves careful consideration.
Agreed. Leaving us, as always, with much more to explore within the material itself.